by putting yourself out there and taking risk and taking that jump, win, lose, or draw, you're likely going to have doors that open up after.
Okay, we are here today with Will Zell. Will Zell is the founder of Zell Capital, an experienced entrepreneur and investor in startup companies. Prior to Zell Capital, Will was the founding CEO of Nikola Labs, where he led the company from the beginning, raising over $20 million in investor capital and building the company into a high-growth phase before successfully handling leadership to his chosen replacement. Prior to Nikola, Will was the founder of 2 other tech companies and several other small businesses in diversified industries. Will and his wife, Beth, live in Huntsville, Ohio, and have 3 children. Will, it's great to have you on the Gravity Podcast.
Thanks, Brett. I'm a big fan of the podcast and very honored to be on with you. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, great. Well, let's hop right in. As you know, our format is to really give the listener an opportunity to hear your full journey. So why don't you tell me a little bit about kind of the early days and where you're from and your family dynamics?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm born and raised in the Bell Fountain, Ohio area. So just northwest of Columbus by about 45 minutes. And actually still live here in my hometown. So I've been fortunate to travel quite a bit, but have never lived outside of Logan County, Ohio. So I grew up in a pretty big family. Actually, I'm the 5th of 7 children. So surrounded by a bunch of sisters, or 5 girls and 2 boys. And grew up in rural Logan County for the first few years of my life, and then we moved into Bell Fountain. Graduated from Bell Fountain High School, and I would say the primary reason why I still live in Bell Fountain was a decision I made when I was a senior in high school. Which, although it wasn't around starting a business, it was the first, I think, real entrepreneurial type decision that I made, which was to run for city council as a senior in high school. So ran for Bell Fountain City Council, had to be in the city running a campaign. So I switched from going to Columbus and staying on Ohio State's campus for the fall of my freshman year to commuting up to Ohio State Lima. And that decision actually has had a lot of implications and ripple effects, and probably the number one reason why I'm still here today.
Yeah, it's a great story, and I'm tempted to just hop right in and talk about that. But before we do, let's back up a little bit. Tell me a little bit about kind of your earliest, kind of memories. I mean, you obviously, at a very young age to run for a city council position in high school says a lot about kind of how you're wired. But I want to maybe see what else is there that kind of would be a similar spark, or kind of tell me more about what you were like as a kid that, might kind of demonstrate some of that same energy.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, having a lot of siblings is really interesting. And there is another dynamic about my family, which I think is somewhat unique. And that's that when I was born, my father was 52 years old. And so we had this really interesting dynamic of a bit of a generational gap, if you will. So my first cousins would be old enough to be my uncles, basically, is the way that it worked out in many ways. And so I think that had a bit of an impact in terms of I don't know if it led to just being a little bit more mature, thinking about the future in different ways. But, I never really knew my dad when he was in his 30s or 40s. By the time I've got really strong memories of my father, he's already in his 60s, right? And so the influences, of your father is someone who is kind of, later on in their life. And I think it just probably created a little bit of a different perspective. But outside of that, I mean, I was never great at athletics. I ran cross country, played tennis in high school. I liked sports, but I was pretty confident that a future as a professional athlete was not in my DNA. And I think really what I think I gravitated towards mostly early on was the community. So I was involved in a lot of social clubs. So I was president of Key Club, involved in student government. So I do give my parents a lot of gratitude and thanks for this. They, from a very early age, taught me and all of my siblings about serving the community, about helping out those who are in need. So a lot of, soup kitchens and involved in community service activities through the church that we went to. I think there were a lot of seeds planted there around like using your talents and your time to do good and make a positive impact. And I've channeled that now into entrepreneurship. But I think that was like the heart of thinking about things such as running for city council and being willing to take risk and make a decision to do those types of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm curious just to kind of back up a little bit. You mentioned, the fact that your father was older when you were born. And I think I understood you correctly in that you felt like kind of his maybe, kind of maturity and being, more seasoned in life kind of maybe sped up the process a bit for you too. That because he was later in life, you were doing things earlier in life that maybe you typically do later in life. Is that true? Or maybe you could say a little more about that.
Yeah, it's something honestly that I think a lot about. So my father passed away back in 2012. So I can't, have these deep conversations with him now, but it is something that I think quite a bit about. And I don't think I can draw any like straight line comparison, connecting A and B, but just, if you think about the wisdom of someone who's been through life, who is, now kind of in their later years, thinking about legacy, thinking about, things that matter the most as you get towards the end of your life. And then like having that as like your direct influence when you're a teenager, right? And like that's your parent. Again, I think there are some things that I missed from that, meaning like I never knew my dad when he was in the prime of his career, if you will, or if he was, when he was really thinking about like the future and building something out. But I think it created a more of an interesting dynamic that like it's this perspective of someone who has experienced the majority of their life already, and how they would influence their children as a parent. So again, not any strong conclusions, but I think it definitely shaped my life in a number of interesting ways. Actually, I should have that conversation with my siblings at some point. I don't think we've ever really talked about that. That'd be interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder. And you said your siblings were how much older? What was this age spread there?
Yep. So my brother's the oldest. So we actually have an older half sister. My father was married once before. But if I think about the children of my parents, there are 7 of us. My brother's the oldest. He's 8 years older than me. And then I have a sister who I think is 5 or 6, 7 years younger than me. Mm-hmm. So my dad actually had his last child when he was like 60 years old. So I don't know how old you are, Brett, but like you got a lot of opportunity ahead of you.
Yeah. No, I was actually the opposite. My first child was born when I was 24, and by the time I'm 50, they'll all be out of the house. So I don't plan to repeat that, but that's what it would be like. It's just getting started at that stage.
Exactly. That's exactly how my wife and I are. So it's really an interesting dynamic that, again, I can't, draw any strong conclusion, but I know it's had a big influence.
Yeah. And just curious, what the dynamic was like with your siblings, kind of having the experience of having siblings that are significantly older and significantly younger, what if any impact did that have, or what was that experience like?
Yeah, so it went my brother and then 3 sisters, then myself and 2 younger sisters. So 5 girls and 2 boys. And my brother and I have a great relationship, but he was 8 years older, right? So as the only 2 boys, it wasn't like he was 2 years older and we could hang out. He's already graduated high school and in college when I'm in middle school. With that said, I would say growing up surrounded by sisters, I think actually was super helpful in understanding and being able to have great relationships with females, if that makes sense. Whether it's my wife, my sister, or just in generally setting, there's a lot to learn when you're surrounded on all sides by sisters.
Definitely.
and I'll leave that right there.
Sure. And do you remember at the time while this was happening, having any sort of sense as to kind of the fact that your father was older and that maybe that was different than your friends, or, kind of this wisdom that you spoke about, the maturity. What was the actual experience like for you as a kid?
The actual experience was just more awkward, right? I think the appreciation has come for it now that I'm an adult, and as I've grown older myself. As a kid, it was just like, basically with my buddies, my dad is the age of their grandpa. So like, how do you like it? And at the end of the day, like, it wasn't that big of a deal. And in some instances, people thought it was cool, but it was more awkwardness in that season of my life versus like really understanding the wisdom and the benefits that came from it.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more as we fast forward. The city council thing. I mean, you mentioned that you were in a lot of community-focused clubs and student government. When does the idea that you're going to run for a city council position in high school, I mean, I don't know of anyone who's ever done that. I'm not sure, kind of how rare it is. It sounds, I'm pretty sure it's pretty rare. Where does that come from? How does that come in? How's that something that you even feel like you've got the confidence to really consider? Tell me about that experience.
Yeah. So the actual kind of the events that led up to making the decision, the driving factor was in the fall of my senior year in high school. I did an internship at the Logan County Chamber of Commerce with the president, directly working with the president of Logan County Chamber for about 8 weeks or so. And his name was Ed Wallace, wonderful, wonderful man. And during that time, so I was president of Key Club. I'd run for student government, didn't get it my senior year, but was already kind of engaged in community service. And I was very politically focused, if that makes sense. So kind of just a political junkie at that stage as well. So through the course of this internship, basically, and Ed, like, I don't know why he thought of this, but like he saw that this opportunity was coming up and started to encourage me, like, you should think about this. Because we started talking about like community change. Like if you were in charge, if you could lead the city, how would you change things? And it was just a really great season of mentorship in my life that I'll always remember and forever be grateful for. But it was like, I think what was implanted was this sense that like, if you feel like you have an idea and you have a voice, even though like it may be against conventional wisdom or other people may think that you shouldn't, have a voice or have an idea, but if you believe you do, then you should at least step up to the plate and be willing to put it out there. So he really kind of is the one that started to like plant those seeds. And my memory may be a little bit foggy now, but I think it was so an interesting point here. I ran as a Democrat in Logan County, Ohio. So Logan County, Ohio is very Republican. It was an at-large seat. So it was a citywide seat, and there were 3 Republican incumbents. And basically the Democratic Party wanted to put up a slate to oppose the 3 incumbents. And at that point, I didn't really know my politics, especially on a local level, where I think party politics matter a lot less on a local level, frankly. And so I'm like, yeah, I'll run as a Democrat. So I connected with a couple of people in the Democratic Party, and they're like, yeah, let's do it. And so the Democratic Party ended up putting... I'm partly chuckling because I'm wondering, did they just not have anybody else who felt like this was going to be worth their time? They're like, you're willing to do it, high school kid? Sure. There may have been some of that. I'll give you that for sure. And I think I was already accepted into the scholars program at Ohio State in Columbus and had like picked out the course was already set. So it wasn't that I was still trying to figure out what I was going to do next. Actually, the path was already set, and I had to make a decision to not do what I was planning to do and do something very different. And the last straw, if you will, and that whole experience was my mom. I mean, she again, growing up, my mother was primarily a stay-at-home mom, having 7 kids. She was an educator before that. She was a teacher. But something I found out actually about my mom, as I've gotten older, she's incredibly creative and is like, she's now 70 and is still like writing books and writing and kind of pursuing this dream that she has. And she's probably a lot more entrepreneurially wired than what she thinks she is. But she basically said, like, do it, go for it. We'll support you. Like, we can figure everything else out, but just go for it. And so I did. Now, interestingly, I think I had to file, it was like in January, I believe, where I had to file for my candidacy for the primary that was in May. And I was only 17 at the time. So there was actually this question of whether or not a 17-year-old can file for an office, to run for an office. And I was actually only 17 during the primary. I didn't turn 18 until July of that year. So can a 17-year-old be on a primary ballot was the fundamental question. And that actually went all the way up to Ken Blackwell, who was Secretary of the State at the time. And the decision back was because I was going to be 18 by the general election by November, then I could be on the primary ballot as a 17-year-old.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that by itself, it says how rare this is, right? Like, people didn't even know the answer to that because they probably never had been asked before. And I'm actually, kind of all kidding aside about, they didn't have anybody. There does seem to be, something that really suggests a tremendous amount of courage and or just kind of like innocence. I'm not sure, what you would call it, but like, there probably was a lot of like seasoned politicians that, for many years said a Democrat could never win in that, and therefore, they run unopposed. I mean, you see this in city politics a lot, even at, the congressional level where, people don't feel certain seats can ever be flipped. And we're starting to see that. But at that time, to maybe your youth, your kind of like conditioning hadn't been changed yet. Yours was really one that was wired towards like, why not me? Let's try it. Let's, follow, as you said, that voice and the idea.
Yeah, no, I agree. And quite frankly, Brett, as I get older, I'm trying to hold on to that as much as I can. And still doing that, like literally with, Zell Capital and other things is like, why not? Like, if you see a problem, right? And this is why like, I really encourage, youth entrepreneurship, young people getting involved. Like, there's a discomfort, it's friction, like to get out there and do this, but go for it. Like, the quicker you can get yourself into a cycle, especially if you feel like you're wired to kind of do something different, the quickest you can get into that cycle of just like taking on a problem and say like, no, I'm just going to try and figure it out, the better. Because in as much as like I'm focused on business now and entrepreneurship, the cycle of like the mental models, the mental approach, the friction, the discomfort of like doing something different, it's the same regardless of what you're trying to do in terms of like going against the stream. So I'm all for like young people just doing something, just starting, just get out there and experience it and respond to it and grow. You'll fail a lot, like you'll hit walls left and right, but it's a fun journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the fun parts about this podcast for me is just kind of seeing how the dots connect and, trying to pull that all together in a story that's somebody's life and then, hopefully allowing the audience to see themselves in that story. And, already I can see that, you've got this small town and you've got this kind of experience with your father, having been, more seasoned and older and then, this mentorship and all of that, along with the support of your mother, really makes perfect sense as to why you would be that somebody that would do something like that. In hindsight, is that how you see it?
Yeah. And it's like, I feel like I'm building that narrative now over time again as I get older and try to think back at the time. I think that, definitely influences towards that. And just the wiring, I'm actually a super competitive person. This is something that I don't know if a lot of people truly understand. You may if you work with me every day, because I do also like to be nice. Like I want to like build great relationships and just have fun if we're going to do something together. But if you put me in a sporting event, I literally want to win at all costs. Like if the time from like start to winning is compressed, like let's say in a basketball game, uber competitive. And the nice thing about like building businesses is you've got a little bit of a longer timeline. Like the journey for startups is quite a bit longer, but there's this competitive edge that I have, and it's probably, I don't know, maybe because I'm was in the middle of 7 kids, but certainly my childhood had an influence on that, I'm sure as well. But you pull all those together, like the willingness to make kind of different choices, a competitiveness to win. And like what I had to learn, what I had to develop was then when you lose, how to effectively process that and turn all of the circumstances of a loss around into strength for the next game, if you will. And like that for me is probably the piece that I've had to work on developing that I think a lot of people, you hit the wall, you have an outcome that you don't like, you lose something. And even if you're competitive, it hurts deeper. So like, how do you turn that pain, that loss into strength for the next time? And that's been a big part of the last 15 years of my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's really an important thing to highlight, but all of that really, but kind of the first part reminds me of Gino Wickman, who you use EOS with your, right? And so Gino's a friend of mine, and his latest venture is called Leap, which is really about entrepreneurship and making that entrepreneurial leap. And he does a lot of work with kids and students and young people. It's for everybody, including an analysis that really has you asking questions, completing a questionnaire that in with his methodology, he believes you can determine just based on these questions if somebody is wired to be an entrepreneur or not, that it is definitely a wiring. So, I'm more of the belief that it's both, that there are people that are wired and also then kind of your conditioning, your kind of atmospheric conditions that are around you. That combination really determines whether or not, you can be successful, including I'm a huge believer, and this is becoming more and more clear to me, that having the support system to wrap the uncertainty and to be able to step into the fear and the potential, quote, failures, right? You've kind of learned that these are learning experiences for you, but just getting to that point can be very hard if you don't have the proper support system around you.
Oh, I agree 100%. I think, I think we talked about like the value of mentorship, the value of having people, that support system around you who you can learn from, who can speak into your life when you're in, both the high points and the low points. And that can be, people that you directly know and have relationship with. A huge part of that also is the content that you consume from great minds that have lived in the past or that currently live today. And what I mean by that is, one, probably the most interesting mental model that I've developed in my life right now that helps me in that particular case is the concept of being anti-fragile. So Nicholas Nassim Taleb wrote The Black Swan. He's written several books, and one of his books is Anti-Fragile. And it's all around this concept of systems that when they're exposed to shock or chaos or pain or stress, not only can withstand those external events, but those external events actually make you stronger. So the definition of fragile is those external events would crush you, they would break you, they destroy you. Most people would define anti-fragile as, I can withstand that. But really what anti-fragile means is that with those stresses and that chaos and shock, you actually get stronger. And he writes the book in the context of systems that exist in our world. for me, the biggest impact has been in my own mind, right? Between my ears and a mental model where, and this is one of the lessons thoughts that I share with young people and entrepreneurs is we have to realize like in this journey of entrepreneurship, there are continuous challenges, problems that you're going to deal with on a daily basis. Like it is what it is. It's just not an easy journey to take, but you must understand that everything that exists in this journey, the good, the bad, the craziness, the shocks, the stresses, everything that exists in this journey is here to serve you as you are pursuing your dream. So they're not liabilities. Everything is an asset. Like the stress, the fact that you are running out of money and you have to figure out how to like raise or you're going to go out of business. Like that event, that moment is there to serve you in the pursuit of your dream. And then you ask me, okay, like, so what happens if you run out of money and you have to shut down your business, right? And that's where that's the first 2 tech companies I started, I had to shut down. And it was like the most painful period of my life, the season of my life, because I went into it with confidence, of course, like, yeah, I'm going to figure this out. Yeah, we'll raise capital. And then you like face the end, like that you never want to face as a business person, where I have to literally close the business, lay people off, and just figure out how to like manage through this. But what I've learned is that view that like that was there to serve me in the pursuit of my dream. Like the lessons that I've learned from those events, the depth of experience and gratitude and like understanding when you get close to the edge, the options that you have as a business person to not freak out and like stay calm. All of that has helped me through the Nikola Labs journey. It's helping me in the Zell Capital journey. Like all of those things, the good and the bad of my past are currently serving me right now as I pursue my dream.
Yeah, no question. And I love that. And that's, again, kind of a big part of why I do this podcast is so that people can really see how all of these events do serve us. That is kind of one of my most deeply held beliefs that, everything is there to serve us and then ultimately to serve other people. So let's put a little bow on the city council experience. Tell me kind of how that unfolded.
Yep. So made it into, it wasn't a contested primary, so 3 Democrats. So I made it onto the ballot for the general election. And through the summer, and it was the summer of 2001, which was interesting just with September 11th. And, I ran a citywide campaign. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. But what I did know, and actually still have record of it today, is that the tagline for my campaign was a voice for the future. And so at the Logan County Fair, I was giving out poems, Will Zell City Council 2001, and then on the other side, a voice for the future. And I actually still ask myself, am I that today? Right? Like it's something I still hold today. And I think about it like, are you today still a voice for the future? Are you thinking about what's next? Like, or are you settling in on life as it is and the status quo as it is, and you're just going to check out and call it good? So anyways, went through the summer, got to the election, and there were 6 people running for 3 spots, 3 Republicans and incumbents, and then 3 Democrats. And I ended up coming in 4th, and I lost only by a little over 100 votes. So I didn't make this seat, but I think it was impressive enough that it got on a bunch of people's radar in terms of like, all right, he didn't just like try to do this thing in the spring and then didn't show up for the fall election. I really, really tried and tried hard. And what that led to was actually a couple of opportunities that opened up. I don't know if you know this or not, but I actually hosted a weekly radio station or radio program in Bellefontaine for 10 years, from January 2002 or February 2002 through 2012. And it was like a weekly radio program all around like current events, local issues, politics. I was able to interview congressmen and state reps and state senators. And it was really, really fun. So that was an experience that directly came out of running for city council. I was president of Key Club in high school. I ended up getting involved in Kiwanis and was president of the Kiwanis Club in Bellefontaine. And I think it was like 19 or 20 at the time. So there was just this like, it was I lost the election, right? But like the doors that opened up from taking the risk and taking the leap were awesome. Like you couldn't even like, it was like, people were like, oh yeah, you lost, whatever. But still, I want you to do this, this, and this, right? And that was kind of the first lesson of like, by putting yourself out there and taking risk and taking that jump, win, lose, or draw, you're likely going to have doors that open up after. It's like failing forward, I think, is what that term is called, right?
Yeah, that is. And it really is a great thing to highlight, because I don't think that even as I sit here today, that is the thought that comes to front of mind as you start to enter into something where failure is an option. I've had the experience of failing forward. I hold the belief that nothing is wrong ever, right? And it's because of that, concept, which is that there's always something that you can learn, something that opens up. In fact, Amy Acton was the commencement speaker at my son's high school graduation recently. And, that was a big part of her speech, is about the hero's journey, and that, nothing's ever wrong. You're never off track, and you're doing this work forever. You're constantly learning. So I think it's really a great thing to highlight, because people forget that. It's more of a hindsight thing. Oh, well, it opened this and that, it learned and led me here. But stepping into it, knowing that is a very different story.
And I think most people look at failure as a negative word, right? Where I look at failure very much as a neutral word. It's like good and bad. And so think about weightlifting, right? Like in weightlifting, you want to get to muscle failure. Like your whole point is to work and exercise a muscle. Let's say it's your biceps, and work it to failure. Why? And is it talk about failure in the negative context at that stage? No. It's working to failure, which is a neutral statement of a neutral expression of the word. And you want to get it to failure because that is the platform for growth. It is only when you stress your muscle and get it to that point of failure that the rips and the tears, if you will, on that muscle, it provides the platform for growth. Now you need nutrition, you need a lot of other things to help you on that journey. But for me, failure is not a negative word. And I need to come up with a different word to use other than failure maybe, but it is this like beautiful part of the journey. And it's not just the big failures and the outcomes. It's that, as a businessman, you're continuously experimenting on things, right? Trying something out, it could be a little decision you make today and like, oh, it doesn't work. It quote unquote failed. But like you learned from it and you applied it to, the doing better the next time. So for me, I don't view the word failure as something that's negative. I view it as an asset, not a liability or negative.
Yeah. And you've got some pretty well documented successes, and I'd like to talk about them, but maybe you can just highlight for a minute the failures, that you did learn from. You mentioned you had a couple startups that didn't work. So talk a little bit about kind of those failures for people to hear, because I know people that have had startup failure. And this is actually one of the things you and I have talked about this, that I'm really deeply moved to try to be a part of the solution, which is not letting 8 out of 10 fail, or 9 out of 10, whatever the numbers are today, and ruin a bunch of entrepreneurs who take on the belief that they are failures or they're not meant to be in a startup. Talk a little bit about the failures you've had that you powered through to ultimately have the successes you've had.
Yep. So I started my first business in real estate, and so investing in properties up in Logan County primarily. And when my wife and I got married, my wife had some assets, and it gave us, between kind of what I'd already started doing and the asset base, able to start growing a pretty aggressive real estate investment business. And then on that kind of journey, and that was good. I cut my teeth on that business a lot, but basically every deal that I got into was a good deal, was a good purchase. There are a couple of things I would do differently for sure, but in terms of like doing the good deal in real estate, like it was pretty successful. So then I started branching out, and I had this kind of evolution as an entrepreneur towards like being interested in figuring out how to solve big problems in the world and then leveraging technology to get there. So started really kind of reading, everything I could about entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley and venture capital and, tech entrepreneurship. And in around like 2012, I was at a conference in Washington, D.C., and I had the first idea for a tech startup. Actually, it was at the end of 2011. And I'm like, all right, I've got my first tech idea. And I'm like, all right, we're going to do this thing. I'm going to start a tech company. And, basically 99% of my time was up in Belle Fountain, Ohio, in terms of professionally. And as I got into 2012, I was like, all right, I need to, if I'm going to build a tech company, I need to go to a big city and really start to build relationships because there's got to be a ton of venture capital there. And that's when I started really coming down to Columbus and building a network. And, one of the walls that I hit that I think probably most entrepreneurs do, especially if you're building a company that needs venture backing or investor backing. A lot of entrepreneurs outside of Silicon Valley, New York, Boston, where a lot of the vast majority of VC dollars go, you've got this expectation that like you're in Columbus, one of the largest cities in the United States, there has to be a robust community of venture capital, right? Like there's got to be a ton of capital there. And the wall that you hit is that there just isn't. And this is back in like 2012. It's thankfully getting better now, but there just wasn't that much risk capital in the region at that stage. That was a very rude awakening. And I had confidence coming in from like what I had built in real estate. And then like, yeah, I'm going to be able to do this. It's you just raise capital and build out tech and get after it. And just unfortunately, like there wasn't really any takers on the investment side. And had I known that ahead of time, I probably would have re-architected both of the business models of those two startups to where they didn't rely on significant investor capital to get to, cash flow. Would have just completely structured it differently. And the other mistake that I made, honestly, is I launched the two. I'd spread myself out too thin in that season of my life as well. So those errors compounded on themselves and just got to the point where like couldn't raise capital, got both products to market, and one was actually generating a decent amount of revenue. It just wasn't profitable. And if you're spending $1,000 and you're only bringing in $250 a month, you run out of, and you don't have long runway, you run out of capital pretty quickly, and the downside is significant. So got to that point, and this is like late 2013, where it was pull the plug time. And it was the legitimate, for weeks on end, just waking up at 2-3 o'clock in the morning, just pure anxiety attack. I mean, I had a lot on the line, family, my wife, huge trust in me, had, young children at this stage, reputation, everything that goes into like when you put yourself out there on the ledge as an entrepreneur and it doesn't work, like it is a very crappy feeling. It just isn't fun. And there were like, I leaned on mentors a lot at that stage. One of a good friend of mine, his name's Jason Duff. He's done just a ton of work here. He basically has just revitalized downtown Belle Fountain over the last decade. And, he gave me a ton of great advice. My senior pastor at my church, ton of great advice. So I had people who could just really help during that time, but it was still dark. You're not going to avoid the darkness. You're just not. Mm-hmm. So how do you manage through it? And then how do you become anti-fragile? That's why that mental model means so much to me today, is that like, how do you take that pain and make it a strength? And what I found out was that when the dust settled, yes, there were failures in business. Yes, it was incredibly painful. Yes, there were like things that you have to work through, months and years after that. But it became like, I learned so much from it that when I stepped up to the plate with Nikola Labs, which was the next company that I started, I was able to execute day one on such a different level. And then like there have been a dozen times at Nikola Labs where we're literally down to like days, if not weeks of cash in the bank. And, before I was freaking out, like back in, with Huddle Woo and Connect to Home, the first two startups, we got to the end and I'm like nuts, like just completely losing my stuff, from a mental perspective. And, step up to the plate at Nikola Labs. It's like, you know what? No, we've got this. Like I'm comfortable being at the edge. I don't like it, but I can play at the edge and then keep my wits about me as a leader to make sure that we focus on the solution to the problem and get that done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's really a great thing. I, as an investor, have learned that I love founders who have battle scars, that have, done this once or twice or more. I actually see it as a massive, check box when I see somebody who's learned a ton about what not to do. Where others might see those people as failures. You don't want to bet on them. They've, had this problem, that problem. And there can be some truth to that. But I think that, when somebody tells me everything they've learned that they now want to apply to the next thing, I feel, pretty good about that. That gets me pretty excited. And so just, tell me for a minute or two about Nikola Labs. You take those quote failures, you hop back in, which says a lot about you because you've been through those dark times, and yet you still have the internal strength, courage, drive to go right back in, knowing that you've got this learning under your belt. What happens?
Yep. So Nikola, first and foremost, the dynamic around being able to access capital changed quite a bit. So I was very fortunate. Some of the founding partners, two of the founding partners at Nikola, is a group called Ecove Capital, and they were just getting started and focused on trying to figure out how to scale tech commercialization out of research institutions in the Midwest. And they were able to bring to the table a network of investors that immediately expanded my relationships and my network beyond, what was just in Central Ohio. And that was a really, really important dynamic to the entire story of Nikola Labs. My role was, as founding CEO, how do we make this a success? And what we started with was technology developed by Dr. Chi-Chi Chen at Ohio State that was focused on primarily wireless power transfer. So getting electricity from point A to point B over distance without wires, and kind of doing that in the context of low power electronics. So if there are sensors everywhere in the Internet of Things, how do we never have to replace batteries on those sensors because they're powered effectively off of the equivalent of a Wi-Fi network? Very new and nascent technology with no existing market. So the story of Nikola Labs is kind of broken into two chapters. The first chapter is as we were in the early days developing the technology and looking for key applications and key markets where we could create value. It took it was important to have a very broad approach. So a lot of traveling, a lot of really understanding the status quo in consumer electronics and smart buildings and smart manufacturing, and really just looking broad to try to match the value that wireless power could create against the status quo, and making sure that the value that we could create is significant enough to displace the status quo. With that said, there was this third factor, which actually has become the stranglehold, if you will, on wireless power, which is the regulatory process. So we were trying to work within the constraints of the regulators, and we finally found in kind of 2017, company launched officially in October of 14. By kind of mid 2017, we had started to narrow in on the first market that had a lot of promise, and that was in sensor-based condition monitoring for manufacturers. Really great value add. So if in a manufacturing facility, if you do vibration monitoring on a motor, let's say a critical motor, and you can see that motor is heading towards failure weeks, if not months ahead of it actually failing, and you can give that heads up to the maintenance team in that facility, and they can go in and fix the problem before it becomes a failure. That is a huge value creation for manufacturers. So we fell in love with that market, and we decided that we're going to go from just this kind of wireless power provider to we're going to build out a system. And initially that system included wireless power. We were integrating it into what we did. And it basically took, by the time we launched our first generation and went through really kind of trying to get all the regulatory approval for that, the FCC more or less has this, and stranglehold is a tough word, but for lack of a better word, that's what I'll call it, because it does actually make a lot of sense as to why they're doing what they're doing. But they limit approval for wireless power companies in terms of like how much power you can transmit over distances. So it ended up actually that the fundamental technology that we started the company with several years before didn't even have great, like enough value add in that application that we're focused on to move the needle. But by that time, we had developed a lot of other key technologies around wireless power. So ultra low power electronic design, really understanding efficiency, efficient energy storage. And we were able to bring to market this beautiful system that's very unique in the marketplace. It's a full offering. So both hardware, software, machine learning. We do installation and service. This system's called Vero. And we've delivered that to the market, and it is serving a huge market need. We're one of the early leaders in this space, and Nikola is on just this incredible growth journey right now, and it's super exciting to watch the company.
Really exciting, and what I want to hear you speak a little bit about as we transition to what you're currently doing is how you chose to transition out of Nikola. I mean, you've got something that had raised a lot of capital, got a lot of traction. You were CEO, founder, and you decide to go on to something else, Zell Capital, which I want to definitely talk about. But tell me a little bit about kind of how you saw your role at Nikola and kind of why you decided to move on to Zell Capital.
Now, it's a great question, and I'll answer it like this. So first and foremost, in business, I view myself like my primary duty. The fundamental thing that matters is being a shareholder of the company. So especially if you have partners or if you have outside investors, I am first and foremost a shareholder of this company that other people have put their money into to be shareholders with me. So being a director of, let's say a director on the board of directors, serves being a shareholder first. Being the CEO or any other type of executive role serves being a shareholder first. So as a shareholder in the company and an executive and on the board of directors, the thing that matters most is to make sure that the right people are in the right seats on this bus as we're going from where we are to the ultimate outcome. And every entrepreneur has to have a level of self-awareness and ask him a fundamental question. Ask him or her a fundamental question. And that question is if you are fortunate enough to start a company and then it begins to experience growth, what that means is that every 10 to 12 months, you're going to be leading a completely new company. And you know this, right? As you go from 2 people to 10 to 20, 20 to 100, the entire business changes. And the demands change, the organizational structure changes, and the type of leadership that is required changes. And so every founding CEO, every founder, in my opinion, needs to really understand whether or not they want to evolve as a leader, to learn what it means to be a leader of a 20-person company or a 100-person company or a 500-person company. And if you're willing to go on that journey, then as a shareholder, like empower the leader to take that journey as long as they want to and they can deliver what it takes to lead at that level. Or are you the type of entrepreneur that like you love a stage of the business? Like you're just really, really good at early stage or really good at growth stage. And for me, that's I'm the second part. I love the early stages of startups, right? I love getting in and trying to figure out like you got chaos and then how do you create something out of it? And I could probably learn how to be the leader in a growth stage. But just for me, it was a super easy decision, which is like, I want to find someone who would just be absolutely better than me. The key though, is I wanted it to be my decision. And that's the conflict, that if you're not thinking about that as a founder, like sooner rather than later, like that intersection is going to happen, which you're not evolving as the leader that is needed for this company. And you've got other directors and other shareholders, and they're seeing that. Then that's where these tough conversations happen. And that's where you see entrepreneurs or CEOs getting kicked out. I kind of had a sense like this is the direction that I wanted to go. So I'm going to work on finding who I believe is the best person in this region that can come in and be the scale-up CEO. And that was Brian Graham. And he came on first as COO in 2018 and then president and COO in 19. And then at the end of last year, he became CEO. Now, with that said, I want to be really explicit. I'm still involved in Nikola Labs. I'm chairman of the board, and my role now has just shifted to working with Brian and the team just to make sure that like they have everything that they need to be successful. So we've got a great board of directors. We've got a great base of shareholders, and we're all there to empower that leadership team to take this all the way. So I haven't walked away from Nikola Labs. My role has fundamentally shifted, and in that fundamental shift, I'm no longer responsible for the day-to-day operations, which created the time capacity for Zell Capital.
Yeah, I think, you're highlighting, something that's really important for entrepreneurs and founders to hear, which is that, you have these two paths that you outlined. One is to learn the role and to keep learning the role as the role changes and, kind of grow within it. Or the other is to be self-aware enough to say, this is the part I really like and that I'm really good at. And after that part's done, I need to move on to something else. But that said, as the chairman of the board, and, I think this is a good transition to Zell Capital, you have learned how to wear a lot of hats, right? Mm-hmm. You can provide value as a chairman to a board, to a CEO, to a senior leadership team, even though you're not the one doing the heavy lifting, right? It's not you're not just on the start. You can be more in the visionary seat at the high level and still be super value additive. And the reason I think that's a good transition to Zell Capital is, as you and I have talked, whether it be mentorship or coaching or other modalities of support around entrepreneurs, that's a big part of what you're doing now with Zell Capital. So why don't you talk a little bit about Zell Capital and share with the audience, what you're doing?
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head, right? In terms of like in a leadership role, and in that role for Nicholas as chairman, like there's still the delivery of value that moves the needle. It's just in its appropriate place based on skill sets and capabilities. So what I've transitioned to with Zell Capital is, and it's something I've been really thinking about for like a decade now, and it's a big dream. And what it is if you look at the world of private markets. So everyone's familiar with the stock market and bonds and treasuries. Like there's this world of public markets where any investor can get in and invest in and day out, right? And if you've got an investment advisor, that's where probably the vast majority of their allocation of capital is focused on. But there's this like whole other world that exists, and it's called private markets. And there you'll find venture capital, you'll find angel investing, you'll find private equity investing, private debt. There's basically this entire world that is private markets that historically have only been open to what is defined as accredited investors. And fundamentally, to be an accredited investor, it's a wealth test. So there's more than this, but in essence, you either have to make $200,000 a year for the last 2 years, or you have to be worth $1 million outside of the value of your primary residence in order to be defined as an accredited investor. And again, there are a few other definitions that go into that, but in essence, it's a wealth test. And what the kind of regulations, the SEC's approach to the private markets has been that a person who is accredited should at least have the understanding and the wherewithal to make a risk appropriate decision for private market investing. Because one of the key elements of investing in private markets is there is no liquidity generally, meaning if I buy a share of a startup company, I can't go and sell that share tomorrow or next month. It's like 7 to 10 years. So you can't get in and out of private market investments like you can public market investments. So accreditation laws have existed to basically be this kind of filter. Now, and you can see how that made sense and why that made sense over time. But we're at a new phase now, in my opinion. We're at the beginning of this new kind of transition, this shift where I believe fundamentally private market investment opportunities are going to open to everybody through leveraging technology, through just the kind of evolving regulatory reality of things. And I would say just the general knowledge of investors, everyday investors. Like there's a lot of like you can learn everything that you want to about private equity and venture capital investing just by spending hours on the internet. So the ability to be educated about the asset class is readily available. So what we want to do at Zell Capital is we actually want to lead a lot of this transition. And what we have done is we recently received effectiveness, or were declared effective by the SEC for a new type of venture capital fund. And what this fund is it's basically a hybrid between a 40 Act registered, 1940 Investment Company Act registered fund. So think of funds like mutual funds or exchange traded funds or interval funds. So funds that have regulatory requirements and burdens with them. Combine that with a venture capital investment strategy. And when you throw those two worlds together, the output is this fund, new fund class that we have created, which is called an access fund. And with an access fund, what makes it unique is that because it's registered with the SEC and subject to ongoing reporting and disclosure, the investment opportunity for the fund is open to all investors. So not just accredited investors, but non-accredited investor. Basically, any U.S. citizen 18 or older is qualified to invest in Zell Capital. So, and we set the minimum investment at $1,000 to make it what I believe is highly accessible from a risk profile perspective. So any U.S. adult can invest in Zell Capital. So they can put money into the fund. And what the fund does is we are going out and we are going to invest in early stage startups. We will be seed and Series A investors, meaning that we are going to invest in tech and tech-enabled companies when they're just getting started. So these are private, very young, very nascent companies that traditional venture capitalists invest in. And that's what we are going to be investing in as well. So the investment opportunity is open to everyone. And the investment strategy is early stage venture capital. And that is likely the first fund of its kind to be launched in the United States.
Yeah, and just kind of like as we start to wrap up and for me, I'm just sitting here listening to this, and in full disclosure, you and I have had some of this conversation before. I'm invested in the fund. I'm a big fan of what you're doing. I really can see though how all these dots connect. You being kind of a leader in whatever it is that you do, and that being kind of your wiring and your life experience, and this new class of an investment vehicle, a fund, is not that different than being 17 and being a new class of politician. This is kind of. And then, you take the failures that you described, including the learning about capital and how, that world existed and then, kind of your community-minded focus. I mean, the non-accredited investor thing is a real game changer. I mean, I really believe that And I read this recently. I don't know if it was Naval or somebody said something about kind of, this, the new internet or the new economy is really about democratization and access. And so giving people access fund is, is the right language, because that's really what you're doing. You're giving people access to wealth creation that in the past only the wealthiest people had access to. That's pretty pioneering. It's pretty new. It's pretty, ballsy. I mean, and it makes a lot of sense, that would be what you would be doing.
Brad, I don't think I've technically been qualified to do anything that I've done in my adult life.
Yeah.
So, but and I think a lot of people struggle with, because that's why I get the question, why are you qualified to launch a fund? I'm like, I don't know. Why was I qualified to run for city council when I was 17?
Right.
And I think the barrier that a lot of us hit is what's called imposter syndrome. Like, I don't fit, I don't belong. Like, why am I here? That's okay. Like, it's part of the journey. Like, figure it out, solve the problem, and get after it. And people do it, execute well, and people will believe in you and support you. It'll happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And Dan Sullivan from Strategic Coach, who I'm a big fan of, says, that it's about capabilities, not credentials. And I actually think what qualifications you lack are actually the exact reason why you're the right person to be doing this. That's true in politics too. I mean, part of our problem is that we have people that are so conditioned politically based on their, environment and that entire system. And the same is true in venture capital. There's a bit of a problem in venture that, there's only really the most credentialed people doing it. And so they just keep doing it the same way, which, doesn't really actually work as well as they'd like to think. If you're kind of just measuring by pure dollars, then okay, fine. But what about the bodies that are getting left behind?
True.
And the people that are not included in this process? To me, that's a pretty massive problem that you're aiming to solve here.
Yeah, we could spend an hour talking about just that, but absolutely. And a good thing for entrepreneurs to think about is, you're going to displace the status quo of an industry. You've got the ability to rewrite the rules, and it's never easy. It's actually super hard to do. But if you could rewrite the rules of an industry, what would you write? And when we're thinking about the Access Fund and early stage investing, there are a lot of great aspects and attributes about venture capital, but there are elements of the status quo that just frankly are underserving so many people, both on the investor side and the recipients of venture capital, and then forcing them into this power law model where you have to go all out at all costs. And if it doesn't work, then there's just carnage. And that's good.
Right.
That's good. And it's good in some investments, but I think a new rule to be written is how do you think about portfolio construction differently in early stage investing?
Couldn't agree more. Well, I'm a big fan of what you're doing, and it's great to have you on the podcast today. Any final thoughts you want to share with the listeners?
No, I want to thank you, Brett. Thank you for your support. I mean, the conversations we've had over years, it means so much to me. You're a pioneer in what you do, and it's just awesome, man. So keep on keeping on, and thanks for this opportunity.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's great to have you, and I'm cheering you on. So we'll keep the good conversations going.
Love it.
Thanks for listening to the Gravity Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe, leave us a review, and follow me on Instagram at Brett Kaufman, on Twitter at bkaufman125, and subscribe to our YouTube channel by searching for The Gravity Podcast with Brett Kaufman. And please send me a DM with any guests or topics that you'd like to hear on future episodes.